colonization of Ireland. As far as the English ruling class might have been concerned, the 19th century was inaugurated by the Irish Rebellion of 1798. Having already survived the American and French revolutions, the immovable object, Ireland, and what the English termed the Irish question, became the biggest issue in late Victorian politics, as perhaps it had been for most of the century. It's like the Negro issue. In any case, their response to what they perceived as a particularly pernicious manifestation of Jacobin conspiracy and French interfere was the dissolve that what have passed and I hate that manifestation of Jacobin conspiracy and French interference was to dissolve what had passed for an Irish Parliament and to declare in 1800 an active union between Ireland and the United Kingdom. In effect, the English state was setting aside the ineffective structures and instrument of indirect rule for those of a more direct and familiar domination. This substitution of one set of institutions for another, in the long view, proved to be indifferent for the purposes of the English state, though it logically followed the evident interests of English capital and Anglo-Saxon ideology. America, with "it's not real." That's kind of how that makes me think. The Irish question became much more a part of the 19th century than it had been for the 18th. It would appear, however, that its character had been fixed long before. James Anthony Froude, in his History of the English in Ireland, provides his readers with what is both a detailed political history and a demonstration of the extent and sort of image of the Irish that had become fixed in the minds of the Englishmen. Froude began by informing his readers that when the military aristocracy of the Normans invaded Ireland in the 12th century, the Irish were the exception of the clergy, scarcely better than a mob of armed savages. Having defeated the defenders of the island, Froude continues, the Normans had three courses of actions towards the conquered people: extermination, armed occupation, and armed colonization. It's the rinse and repeat of history over and over and over and over and over again. It's like, oh my God, change the History Channel. We're done. You can't colonize anywhere else. Stop. Excuse me. The Normans, Froude laments, chose an entirely different path. The Normans in occupying both England and Ireland were but fulfilling the work for which they were specifically qualified and gifted. They did not destroy the Irish people. They took the government of them merely as the English have done in India, dispossessing the chiefs, changing the loose order of inheritance into an orderly succession, giving security of life and property, and enabling those who cared to be industrious to reap the fruits of their labor without fear of outrage and plunder. America. Their right to govern lay in their capacity of governing and in the need of the Irish to be governed. Hold up. You gonna make me blush. Sorry. The end result was an unfortunate one for the civilizing mission of the Normans. Instead of extending English civilization to the inhabitants of the island, the conquered people absorbed their Norman rulers racially, culturally, and politically. By the second half of the 14th century, England having undergone the disaster detailed above, judicial and political attempts at assuring a specifically Anglo-Norman presence in the four countries of the English Pale, Dublin, Meath, Kildare, and Louth, were in actuality indications of the futility of the designs that had followed the conquest. Indeed, the term conquest was a conceit of English political history. With respect to their political relations in England, Ireland, and more precisely the Pale, staggered between indirect rule and home rule. Depending on the resources of the English state, the preoccupations of English feudal society, and the capacities and proclivities of various feudal lords in Ireland to command national or English loyalties. In brief, such was the situation until the 16th century. In economic and often in political terms, feudal Ireland was almost entirely independent from England. This mode of English sovereignty in Ireland was to be initially pierced during the reign of Henry the Seventh, from 1485 to 1509, and finally reshaped altogether during that of Henry VIII, 1509 to 47. Between these first two kings and the Tudor dynasty from 1485 to 1603, English policy towards Ireland managed to produce a bizarre series of results. An administrative unification of Ireland under the Earl of Kildare, a Celtic-sized Norman family, the fomenting of a rebellion led by Kildare as the champion of Catholicism following the rupture of the English state with the papacy, and with the suppression of rebellion and the execution of some of its leaders, a new subjugation of Ireland and its most powerful families. The stabilization of the English feudal monarchy had brought with it the possibility of transforming Ireland into an English colony. Once Elizabeth I, 1533 to 1603, was established on the English throne, following the brief and chaotic reigns of her siblings, Edward VI from 1547 to 53, and Mary I, 1553 to 58, English policy towards Ireland, not for the first time or last, changed dramatically. The English set upon the plan for putting Ireland to plantation. To what? As the best means to subdue the island. Sorry, I keep looking not at the camera. I want to fly. The most extensive of these plantations was that to be Londonderry, established in 1608, and roughly contemporaneous to the Virginia plantation. Girl. 1619. I need to read that one. My papa got it for me. My papa, he's amazing. He gets me a lot of things. Books being one of them. He gives me love too. You know? To the more than 30 million descendants of American slavery. $4.79. That's not that bad. Crazy when you smile. 401. Let's take a little breaksies. Oh, that smells good. Crazy When You Smile by Patricia Smith. I'd never seen them up this close before, even though the awkward reckoning of our collapsing distance. Hatred of what I am blooms reckoning on their skin. Their arms and faces blare in crimson while they wave their placards with my breath, misspelled. I never thought that I would find myself the object of foreboding thick enough to make a white man bare his teeth. All lucky struck and rotting just to hiss a tightening noose in my direction, or to spot a mother in a boxy robe of dripping flowers, hair all done up and gelled and wrapped around Velcro rollers. Oh, this is very long. Sorry, I'm not going to finish this for this video. Oh, I'm not going to finish this for this video because there's words in here I can't use. I'm definitely gonna have to read this soon. Sorry. The Englishmen and Lowland Scotmen were lured to Ireland. The Englishmen and Lowland Scotsmen were lured to Ireland by the promise of free land. Manifest destiny. Manifest destiny. So first we got the plantation in Ireland with the colonization of Ireland. Then we got manifest destiny with the promise of free land. Their job was to drive the Irish into the woods and fortify their own villages. Doesn't that sound a little too familiar? The West just can't pick a new mode or method of colonization. They have to do the same stuff over and over again because so far it's worked. But the suppression of the rebellions that followed, the major rebellions were led by Shane O'Neill in 1559, the Fitzgeralds of Desmond between the years of 1568 and 83, and by O'Neill, the former Earl of Tyrone. You better call Tyrone. And Donnell from 1594 to 1603 required such extensive expenditures that at least one historian, R.D. Edwards, surmises that the poverty of the crown, which was a serious factor of the 17th century conflict, with Parliament, was at least in part due to the commitment over Ireland. Whether this was the case or not, a more lasting pacification of Ireland was not achieved until the final years of Elizabeth's reign, despite the persistence of legends which put it otherwise. The reputation of the Elizabethan settlers, won for the most part in other fields, remained, but their English enterprise, lacking all sustained sense of purpose, proved deservedly transient, and so in succeeding centuries the somber tale of plantation, of rebellion, of Cromwellian violence and civil and religious war, of the penal code, mocked the illusion of the final Elizabethan settlement. Though it was Elizabeth's administration that initiated the policy, it was under James I, 1603 through 25, that the colonization of Ireland by planters and farmers from Scotland and the western countries of England assumed significant proportions. And they're going based off of the Anglo-Saxon ideology. First in Ulster, and then proceeding to the alienation of Irish land in North Wexford, Longford, and Leitrim. By 1641, that is the midst of the reign of James' successor, Charles I, 1625 to 49, William Petty, the 17th century English economist and statistician, would estimate there was 260,000 undertakers, as the Protestant colonists were called. Oh, undertakers were Protestant colonists. Among 1.5 million people living in Ireland. And it was also in the year that the Irish Rebellion began. It was also in the year that the Irish rebelled again, mounting the most serious and lethal effort to reject English rule since the conquest. In English historiography, the rebellion became known as the Massacre of 1641. This rebellion was to last for 11 years, a fire that ultimately had been attended by Cromwell himself. What followed was what Fraud with inadvertent irony would have us know as the penal era, 1652 to 47. It would be during this latter period that Ireland assumed the characteristics that typified the Irish experience until the early 20th century. Colonized, absentee land ownership, Catholic persecution, and Protestant privilege, the land alienation of its laboring classes, and the corrupt, punitive administrations and official terror. It was again during the penal era. Wait, let's highlight that. It was again during the penal era that much of the restrictive legislation written by the English Parliament would appear to complete the de-rationalization of the Irish economy. Acts against the marketing of Irish cattle in England, 1681 against Irish woolens and colored linens, 1699 against glass, against glass in 1746. Once these policies had accomplished their purpose, free trade could be reestablished. It destabilizes so that they could take over. That's what that said to me. So, by 1801, free trade between Great Britain and Ireland was a reality. However, Irish industry, with one exception, linen, could not withstand English competition. After the Union, Ireland therefore became more rural, more agricultural, more economically specialized than it had been previously. Ireland had been transformed into a dependent sector of the English economy. Such were the historical experiences that informed Irish nationalism in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. The psychic and intellectual characters of the Irish workers who immigrated to England in the 18th and 19th centuries to complement the labor of the emergent English proletariat were determined to a large extent by these same events. Certainly, the social and political relations of the immigrant Irish worker with their English counterparts were severely constrained by the past, consisting of almost unmitigated hostility between the interests that had come to be identified with their respective national entities. English working class consciousness in the Irish worker. The Irish immigrant was an important element in the industrial English working class. By 1841, 400,000 Irish-born immigrants were living in Great Britain. He was, as Thompson describes, the Irish worker of the early 19th century, the cheapest labor in Western Europe. Irish workers were recruited and used to fill the heavy manual occupations at the base of industrial society, which required a spendthrift expense of sheer physical energy, an alteration of intensive labor and boisterous relaxation, which belongs to pre-industrial labor rhythms, and for which the English artisan or weaver was unsuited both by reasons of his weakened physique and his Puritan temperament. America. It just reminds me a lot of America because we're in an industrial core. So it just copies and repeats. Still, Thompson's explanation for the need to complement the English working classes was not the rationale that prevailed at the time. Engels was much closer to the English manufacturing class, and perhaps more accurate in his assessment of their motives when he observed that the Irish have discovered the minimum of the necessities of life, and are now making the English worker acquainted with it. For whatever it's worth, it would have been inconsistent with the tenets of Anglo-Saxonism to detach the English worker from a racial hierarchy, which that was quite adequate in locating the deficiencies in the English race and the Irish race. Irish were the first black people, that type of thing. Race as a social construct, that type of thing. The Irish worker, having descended from the inferior race, so his English employers believed, the cheap market value of his labor was but its most rational form. My sissy texted. What are y'all thinking? Ow, my elbows. Setting aside for the moment popular prejudices, The English working classes, especially those at the industrial core of English industry, had more occasion than their superiors to form very different attitudes towards their Irish counterparts. Indeed, in the early 19th century, the opportunities for the formation of successful social movements built on Irish and English workers were frequent and seemed promising. Irish labor leaders took prominent roles in working class agitation in England in the Chartist movement, for example, and it is a widely held belief that working class movements and organizations in England in general were modeled from Irish or organizational methods. Ooh. The extent to which the direction of a unified and radical working class movement have been realized and subsequently so easily dispatched in the early 19th century has troubled at least one historian of the period so deeply that it occasioned uncharacteristic speculation. E. P. Thompson, reviewing the observations that Engels had made on the positive in parentheses revolutionary effects consequent to the mixture of the two races in the working class. Hold up. Because race is a social construct. There's only one race, the human race. The more facile, excitable, fiery Irish temperament with the stable reasoning, persevering English, himself paused to reflect on the political possibilities that English capitalist production had inevitably produced. It was an advantage to the employers at the time. I'm not gonna. Ooh. Let's see. Did she text me back? It was an advantage to the employers at the time when precision engineering coexisted with tunneling by means of shovel and pick to be able to call upon both types of labor. I'm trying to think of like a job like that right now. Where you can like use a handyman or a machine. But the price which had been paid was the confluence of sophisticated political radicalism with the more primitive and excitable revolutionism. The confluence came in the Chartist movement. Once before, in the 1790s, it seemed possible that English Jacobism and Irish nationalism would engage in a common revolutionary struggle. If O'Connor had been able to carry Ireland with him as he carried the north of England, then the Chartist and Young Ireland movements might have come to a common insurrectionary flashpoint. Chartism, however, proved to be the high point of cooperation between the Irish and the English elements of the working class in England. This movement, organized behind the People's Charter, the platform of universal suffrage, annual parliaments, and parliamentary salaries, and represented by demonstrations, petitions, riots, and rebellions, though nearly politically nor ideologically homogeneous, meaning not everyone has the same beliefs. I had to look up that word because I was like, what? But it reminded me, homo, same. Hetero, different. Heterosexual, you are attracted to the opposite sex. Sorry, I'm closing my blinds because people can see me. And then homo, you're attracted to the same. So if you hear those root or whatever prefix, whatever, I need to get a grammar lesson. And had once held the promise of an enduring organization. Instead, it collapsed totally. Yup. From within and without. Oh. After the late 1840s, the tentative efforts that might have resulted in a political significant the tentative efforts that might have resulted in a politically significant class solidarity was frustrated by events of both political and economic character. In England itself, the defeat of the Chartist protests came with the extent and kind of reaction of the English ruling class, aptly recounting by Thompson. It was the organ of the middle-class radicalism. Oh. The times which led the outcry, for example, of severity, the advice was followed. On the 9th of January, 1831, judgment of death was recorded against 23 prisoners for the destruction of a paper machine in Buckingham. Endorsed it on the 11th against 3 for extorting money and 2 for robbery. In Norwich, 55 prisoners were convicted of machine breaking and rioting. In Ipswich, 3 for extorting money. In Petworth, 26 for machine breaking and rioting. At Gloucester, upwards of 30. At Oxford, 29. And in Winchester, upwards of 40 convicted. 6 were left for execution. At Salisbury, 44 prisoners were convicted. And it was the Whig ministry, again, that sanctioned, 3 years later, the transportation of laborers to Tolpuddle in Dorsetshire. You know what, who had the insolence to form a trade union. Union busting now. Following the laws, like the police protecting property, not the people, blah, 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 because that's what you're getting prosecuted for. You know what I mean? Like that type of thing. Following this era of overt class warfare and its accompanying persecution, the English working class, as we have seen, turned towards trade unionism as its primary form of activity. In part, this was also a reflection of the social consequences concomitant to the growth of English trade production. Highlight it. But yeah, I have my notes for this, and I need to see how I can link my Discord so you can access the notes and download it. The English worker in the second half of the 19th century began to enjoy certain of the prerequisites of labor aristocracy in the world system. In Ireland, the late 1840s was the time of the great harvest disasters that came to be known as the potato famine or the Great Hunger. Girl, we better be in a great hunger ourselves. We better start checking on them water supplies and food. I'm so serious. Even myself, I'm over here like shaking in my boots a little bit. Its immediate consequences were both the momentous immigration from Ireland to the United States and the precipitation of an even more extreme nationalism among Irishmen, both home and abroad. Together, these political and economic setbacks, on the one hand to English and Irish industrial workers, and on the other hand to Irish farmers, peasants, and industrial workers in Ireland, resulted in both an ideological and physical drifting apart of the two races. Oh my God, I don't know how to highlight. From the mid-19th century on, among English workers and the ideology of English nationalism. From the mid-19th century on, among English workers, the ideology of English nationalism gained ascendancy over the counter-ideology of international class solidarity and socialist hopes. Bro, and that's what that's saying. If it's based off of Anglo-Saxonism, what do we need to do? Deconstruct Anglo-Saxon English ideology to be able to come together in a because historically it's based off of racism, right? Sometimes I hate the way that my voice sounds and sometimes I love it. Depends on the tone and the cadence and the blah, 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 blah. Oh. I don't know why I opened my phone. I should not have done that. I just saw a video of a friend that passed. That's unfortunate. This was part of a conservative reaction, trade unionism, to political defeat and economic growth. But it also had to do with radical directions the Irish working class and the nationalist Irish middle class had taken. As Marx had often stated in one fashion or another, the English working class will never accomplish anything before it gets rid of Ireland. Early on, of course, it had been the presence of the Irish immigrant as a distorting and depressive element of the labor market that had produced markedly anti-Irish sentiment among English workers. Racism, xenophobia. This hostility had merely confirmed and complemented the racial feeling extant. What? Exatant. Extant. Among England's ruling classes, the historical basis of which we traced above. Later, from the 1850s onwards, the development of sympathy among English workers towards Irish nationalism became even more remote with the appearance of Irish radical middle-class nationalism, the Home Rule movement, and the more radical peasant and working-class nationalist movement had assumed the form of revolutionary agrarian movement. By the end of the 19th century, the English people were at one with respect with the Irish question. Wherever exceptions existed, they were associated with political weakness and inconsequentiality. Inconsequentiality. I don't know how to say that one, but it's okay. There's no consequence. There's no consequences. The proletariat and the English working class. The terms English and Irish have been used in the preceding discussion for convenience. It would have been most difficult to be both precise while treating the subject at an appropriate length. One hopes, however, that such conveniences have not escaped the reader's attention. Given the consistent emphasis here on ethnic and cultural conservatisms and their importance, though Ireland is but a small island, the integration of the Irish people was by no means an accomplished fact by the time of the Great Famine and the major immigration from Ireland to the 19th century. Indeed, some students of the immigrations are quite specific. Low power. To the regions, local cultures, dialect groups, and occupations from which successive immigrants were drawn, and how these particularities influence historical movements. The Irish peoples have been in the process of achieving a national identity and a national culture. This is the last part for chapter 2. Since the Norman-led conquest, they have not done so when the time came for the mass relocation that has marked their collective history for the past 200 years. Theirs is then a national identity deeply marked by the Irish dispersion. But even more to the point, we have seen the generic term, the English working class, or the English proletariat, mask the social and historical realities that accompanied the introduction of industrial capitalism in England and its empire. Social divisions and habits of life and attitudes that predate capitalist production continued into the modern era and extended to the working classes located in Britain-specific social sensibilities and consciousness. The English working class was never the singular social and historical entity suggested by the phrase. An even closer look of its elements, for we have merely reviewed the more extreme case of the Irish, would reveal the social divisions, some ethnic, such as Welsh, Scottish, and even more recently West Indian and Asian, some regional, and others essentially industrial and occupational. meaning it's not just English people, but it erases their history when we just talk about just the English working class as just the English working class when it was not just them, it was everybody. Not everybody, but the people that was just mentioned. The negations resultant from capitalist modes of production, relations of production, and ideology did not manifest themselves as an eradication of opposition among the working classes. Instead, the dialectic of proletarization disciplined the working classes to the importance of distinctions between ethnics and nationalities, between skilled and unskilled workers, and, as we shall see later in some more dramatic terms, between races. The persistence and creation of such oppositions within the working classes were a critical aspect of the triumph of capitalism in the 19th century. Highlight that. You know how it's like divide and conquer? Neither Marx nor Engels were unaware of the. Damn, I'm yelling. Neither Marx nor Engels were unaware of the proletariat's failure to become a universal class. Both studied the Irish question closely, were active in the attempts to resolve its destructive impact on the historical processes of English working class formation, and commented on its import for future proletarian organization. Nevertheless, the impact of their experience with the English proletariat on their theory of the proletariat's historical role appears to have been slight. Shlomo Alvinri observes that the universalistic nature of the proletariat does not disappear in Marx's later writings. When his discussion concentrates mainly on the historical causes of the emergence of the proletariat, what was at the outset a philosophical hypothesis is verified by historical experience and observation. The universalistic nature of the proletariat is a corollary of the conditions of production in its capitalist society, which must strive for universality on a geographical level as well. This would appear to confirm one of Engels' more famous estimation of their work. This is what Engels said. Marx and I are ourselves partly to blame for the fact that the younger people sometimes lay more stress on the economic side due to it than stress on the economic side than is due to it. We had to emphasize the main principle vis-a-vis our adversary vis-a-vis our adversaries who denied it, and we had not always the time, the place, or the opportunity to allow the other elements involved in the interaction to come into their rights. But when it was a case of presenting a section of history that is of a practical application, it was a different matter, and there was no error was possible. Girl, my brain, I'm hungry. Engels was absolutely correct, though the instance to which he was immediately responding might deceive. The distinction that Engels was making here between history and theory can, at one level, be read as an attempt to differentiate between the functions of the publicist and the scientific philosopher. Such an interpretation would, in fact, trivialize Engels' intent. Like Marx, Engels understood that their attempt to construct a total system of the materialist conception of history would bear the imprint of the historical moment. Not only ideology and philosophy, but all human activity was of such a nature. We make our histories ourselves, but, in the first place, under very definite assumptions and conditions. Among these, the economic ones are ultimately decisive. But the political ones, etc., and indeed even the traditions which haunt human minds, also play a part, although not the decisive one. What history demonstrated to Marx and Engels was that dialectical change was never a total negation of the conditions from which it generated, but a transformation of the meaning, intent, and directionality of the elements and forces that of the pre-existing whole. This meant that their work itself, the critique of bourgeoisie society and industrial capitalism, would someday, when the material forces of society had progressed beyond their stage of development in the 19th century, be subject to criticism, negation. That which was ideological, partial consciousness, in their study of history would be transcended by a necessary higher form of social thought corresponding to its historical moment. Perhaps the most obvious of the ideological constructs that appear in the work of Marx and Engels and most of the Marxists who have followed them are the notions of the proletariat as a revolutionary subject and the class struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. They persist in Marxian thought and precisely in the terms suggested by Isaiah Berlin. The Marxist doctrine of movement in dialectical collisions is not a hypothesis liable to be made less or more probable by the evidence of fact, but a pattern uncovered by a non-empirical historical method, the validity of which is not questioned. To comprehend this haunting of radical European thought and its Eurocentrism, it becomes appropriate to review the socialist tradition from which Marx and Engels emerged and that had for its historical setting the late 18th century and the early 19th century. Here we will discover the grounding of the pattern that thrust European Marxism into an era for which it was not prepared, the modern world. Chapter 2 is done.